Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, depending on where you're logging in from. I'm excited that you're here tonight. You are here for applying to Ivy League and highly selective colleges. I'm Jeff Durso-Finley, and I'm going to be your host tonight. And this particular webinar and session will cover sort of overall strategies and approaches for applying, to the most selective schools in the country. And we're going to focus a little bit on the Ivy League, as that's obviously a group of colleges of interest, but also sort of the admission approaches, hyper-selective schools, others that have low admission rates, just so that you can get a sense of how to enter into those application pools and hopefully find success. Before we get rolling, let me tell you a little bit about International College Counselors. This is a fantastic group of highly experienced college counselors who will focus and help those students and families on whether it's undergraduate or college planning and guidance, helping kids build school lists and application strategies, helping them refine their extracurricular interests and build resumes and candidacies, do a lot of essay work, application review and analysis, interview prep, everything that you could possibly imagine that goes into creating a compelling application and a compelling candidacy. International College Counselors will help your student or you, succeed in the application process. And I think one of the things that I've been the most impressed about since I've joined the International College Counselors is the effort that this group goes into staying completely relevant, on point, knowing what the changes are immediately. We talk daily about some of the policy changes, admission changes. It is a very experienced, as I mentioned, an informed college advising group. And it's been just a pure joy to be part of that, endeavor. Before we dive into the content about applying to highly selective institutions, including the Ivy League, I need to tell you a little bit about myself, so you know where I'm coming from. I was an admission officer at Brown University in Providence for almost 10 years, which really for me was a fantastic education in itself for how highly selective schools work, how admission policies are implemented, how they build a class. Incredibly instructive and helpful for them when I moved on to the college counseling world, where I spent 20 years in highly selective boarding school, Lawrenceville School, where I helped and facilitate or helped create candidacies for literally hundreds and hundreds of applicants to highly selective schools. And it was just just very lucky to gain a lot of insight onto why particular applications find success, the challenges that the admission process presents within those highly selective environments. I've been lucky enough to work with some amazing colleagues to have 2 different publications on picking a college and understanding athletic recruiting. And in fact, I'm working on a 3rd book now. So I've been doing admission and college counseling for, oh gosh, I'm moving on 40 years now. But it's been a wonderful ride. And I feel very lucky to be part of the International College Counselor community. So that's a little bit about me and a little bit about where we're coming from. So we're going to dive in and give you a little bit of an overview of what the program and the presentation is going to be about. If you're here tonight, you understand that sort of admission into Ivy League schools and highly selective schools is obviously competitive, and you're trying to get some information on how to navigate that. One of the things that's interesting about this particular area of hyper-selective admission is that you may have heard something about the enrollment cliff out there, or demographics are changing. Regional colleges are seeing a decline. Colleges and universities are closing. This does not affect the highly selective schools in the Ivy League. They continue to get more and more selective, and they continue to have higher and higher applicant pools and lower admit rates. And this is actually spreading to other highly selective institutions. I was doing some research this morning and found, over 30 colleges and universities in the United States that have admission rates of 10% or lower in the last year. And while that in itself is a crazy statistic, that is not representative of where a particular student will end up in an applicant pool, because that assumes that if you have to take out specialized populations, athletes, gender balance, international versus domestic. So when you apply, as from a particular school or from a particular area with a particular major, that the actual admission rate is oftentimes much lower. So it is a selective and challenging environment. Now, that said, while gaining an acceptance to these highly selective schools can be challenging, if not difficult, it's not impossible. Obviously, it happens on a regular basis. But what part of that is the preparation that comes before you file the application, a little bit of strategic approach, and figuring out where, when, major, creating a candidacy that's particularly compelling. So that's really what we're going to talk about, is how to put those things together, what these colleges and universities are looking for. And I would just throw out there that in addition to talking about the Ivy League, it's important to note that places like Stanford, Duke, Vanderbilt, Georgetown, MIT, other Rice, other Northwestern, other really highly selected schools, the component parts of the application and the process are apply. And you can use that as you go forward. So, again, part of the draw of this particular program is this notion of the Ivy League. And so we thought we'd take a second to talk about what is the Ivy League. And interestingly enough, the term Ivy League was coined in the 1930s by a sports writer from the New York Times, who was talking about the rise of intercollegiate sports, and particularly football. And so the presidents of these 8 institutions got together because they were concerned about the influence that intercollegiate sports, and again, especially football, was having on their institutions. So they created their own athletic conference that was formed in the 1950s. So the Ivy League is, in essence, an athletic conference. That's where it came from. So there's 8 member schools, many of which you've heard of. And they've been, playing against each other for 80 years at this stage. And again, there's schools that you've run across: the Columbia, Cornell, Harvard, Penn, Princeton, Dartmouth. So over time, these institutions, given their focus on academic excellence and their balance of the social, the residential, the extracurricular, the academic, and the athletic, a total experience, have really come to have a connotation or a reputation of academic excellence, and to a certain point, selectivity. They tend to be highly well supported by their alumni body, have tremendous resources. But that is in essence what the Ivy League is. It's an athletic conference of 8 highly successful, highly academic institutions that students and families tend to be drawn to because of those opportunities that exist there. So when you think about the Ivy League, I think it's oftentimes students and families tend to lump them in together as one particular cohort. And that comes from some of the things that I was referencing, right? They're obviously very prestigious and selective, academically challenging. Campuses are beautiful. They're all up in the Northeast. These are private institutions that even the smallest feels like a university setting. The acceptance rate we're going to talk a little bit about. But again, the resources there are pretty remarkable. And what they do is, in terms of financial aid, everything is need-based. There are no merit scholarships, there are no athletic scholarships within the Ivy League. You will hear someone, or you'll read something in the newspaper that says, oh, X, Y, and Z got a track scholarship to the University of Pennsylvania. No, they didn't. They don't exist. They do not give merit scholarships. They do not give athletic scholarships. Everything is based on need, so that they can bring in the broadest sense of a college-bound population when they develop their enrollment. So again, they tend to be lumped in together because of these similarities, which makes sense. Although I do want to take a second to talk a little bit about some significant differences that exist within the Ivy League, because they're there. Location is very different. The size, you've got Dartmouth, which is a little bit over 4,000. Cornell's almost getting close to 15,000. The curriculum could be very different. You've got Brown with its open curriculum. You've got Columbia with its core curriculum. Being in Hanover, New Hampshire, and being in New York City is a very different environment. Being at University of Pennsylvania and Philadelphia versus Cornell's Ithaca campus, very different environment. Dartmouth D-Plan and their quarters and their emphasis on the outdoors, versus the other opportunities that exist within the city schools. You've got the eating clubs at Princeton. You've got the residential colleges at Yale. There really are some pretty tremendous differences. So while there might be some historical ties, if you're going to be in some of these applicant pools, you really need to dig in and understand what some of those differences are. Because again, whether it's curriculum, whether it's setting, whether it's social life, whether it's the academic structure of the program, campus ethos, there are some significant differences that need to be kind of sussed out to determine whether or not there is a good fit for your child or for you. So again, we have made some consistent references to admission rates and the selectivity of the institutions. I'll leave this up on the screen for a little bit because it takes some time just to digest this. And you can see just how things have changed in the last 10 years. A place like Penn is nearly doubled in its applicant pool, which is just astonishing. But others have gone up, 40, 50, 60% in the last 10 years. And again, when I left college admission in 2001, it was part of it was because we had moved to a model where we were looking for reasons to say no versus reasons to say yes, because the applicant pool had gotten so strong. And this was 25 years ago, right? So it's really quite a process in terms of gaining entrance into these institutions. And I'm going to pause for a second as you sort of digest these numbers. And if you look to the far right, one of the things that ICC does is that we crunch the numbers every single year for the students that we work with to see how they fare within these highly selective pools. And you can see the acceptance rate for the students who we work with as being significantly higher than the overall admit rate. And again, based on the way in which we can help students create their candidacies. So yes, it's selective. Yes, it can be challenging. Yes, the numbers can be overwhelming. But with the right approach, the right strategy, thinking about how your major fits with your interests and aspirations, you can maximize your candidacy and maximize your self-presentation in a way that can give you a leg up in the process. And the statistics and the numbers bear that out. So right now we're just sort of setting the stage here, and really, so the next question is, if given the selectivity, and again, this is true of what the hyper selective schools, highly selective schools, the 10% schools, whatever you want to call them, what in essence, in the grand scheme of things, are these hyper selective schools looking for? Okay, and that's really where we're going to focus the next section of this discussion is what's being analyzed when students enter into these applicant pools. So what's the application process? What's the admission lens? What's the evaluation that takes place within the Ivy League admission process and within the hyper selective schools? Now, as you might imagine, when you have generally 5 and 6 and 7% admit rates, and you're highly subscribed in term and popular, you are as an admission office and as an institution, you're trying to create a community in excellence in all of its forms. All right, and you start with the academic realm, and we'll dive into that. But really, you're trying to create a community, a diverse community. And you have the option of this enormous applicant pool from students who are literally coming from around the world. And when you and they want a diverse community, and sometimes you hear the word diversity and it gets kind of melted down into things like ethnic diversity or racial diversity. But within the highly selective schools, it is so much broader than that, right? It's academic diversity. Do you want STEM kids? You want arts? You want writers? You want musicians? You want theater arts kids? You want geographic diversity. It's when a lot of colleges like to put out on their end of the year, statement that they've got students from all 50 states. They want all their athletic programs to win. They want to support students who have, legacy interests or longtime standing history with the school, but they also want to bring in first generation kids and support that aspect of building a community. So again, it's a notion of nurturing special talents, nurturing diverse interests, and creating a community in all of its forms. Right? And that's something to keep in mind. When I worked on the college side, and I would get students who would come up to me at the end and say, "All right, I don't understand. I have really good grades and I have really good scores, and I was the class president, and my extracurriculars are really strong, but I wasn't admitted. Can you tell me what was wrong?" And that was not a phrase that ever came up in admission committees, to be perfectly honest. And to a certain point, I started developing this sort of explanation, which sounds like kind of an excuse, or trying to sort of or being slippery. But there's always a reason why somebody is admitted to a highly selective institution. Something that admission officer can point to that says, given these grades, given these scores, given these extracurricular commitment, given their residential life, potentially their impact, we think we should invite this person to join the community because of this reason. So there's always a reason why somebody was admitted. But there's usually no reason why someone was not admitted. Everything was great. It's just the admission wheel did not come around and land on their candidacy. And that's sort of hard to grasp, right? Because this is one of those things in the highly selective world where a student can do everything right, absolutely everything right, and not necessarily gain what they're after, because of the incredible strength of these pools. And I will give you one other description just so you can understand, without actually being in the admission pools, or being in the admission room, excuse me. It's sort of hard to wrap your head around the size and the scope of what the admission pools look like. But I'd always held that at Brown University, when I worked there, we could admit our class, and we would probably take 2,400 to get 1,400 kids in, take that admitted group and throw it out, go back into our pool again, admit another class and throw it out, and do that 2 more times. And the 5th class we admitted, after throwing away the first 4, would statistically be identical to the first one. That's how crazy some of these applicant pools are. And again, this was over 20 years ago. I can only imagine what it's like to be at places like Princeton and Stanford, and at this stage, with the size of those applicant pools and the strength of the kids who are applying. So again, the idea is that there is something compelling within the application, where an admission officer will look at that and say, yes, they have the grades, they have the scores, they have the extracurriculars, they have the campus impact, and then there's this, which makes the admission officer, sit in a room and argue why this person should be admitted. Okay, and so now we're going to get into a little bit more specifics. That's sort of admission officer talk, but we'll dive in. Right. So in the grand scheme of things, if you were to get on your computer and type in, into Google, a college fit, you would get millions of responses. And this is one of those sort of concepts that exist out there in the highly selective world. Because all colleges and universities are looking for a fit. Now, how they define fit is very, very different. The University of North Carolina, part of that fit is supporting the in-state population. If you're Wellesley, part of your institutional fit is that it's a single-sex school, right? So each institution has their own notion of what defines fit. But this really applies to the elite programs. And so, you've got, even within the Ivy League, Brown University, we used to look for students who were going to use the open curriculum incredibly well. That was a defining element of our institution. So we needed to have students who were not going to founder with all the options that were available. All right, a place like Cornell has sub colleges, and they read specifically by fit, both for the major and within the college, because the hotel school and the ILR school and the engineering school and the ag school, they all read differently. So they're going to find the institutional fit, within Cornell. Who's going to really embrace the core curriculum at Columbia and all the dual degree programs that exist in Penn? So they're going to look to see whether students that have the academic chops to be able to be successful, do they match or do they fit with the institutional ethos, with the curriculum, with the major, with the program. They do spend a lot of time, trying to figure out whether or not an applicant is a good fit for that institution. And I think writ large, they are, looking to see if they're going to contribute to the campus life, or they're going to add to the fabric of the institution. Do they meet the educational ethos, or how the program works, both residentially and academically on that campus? One of the phrases that I sometimes use when I work with students is that an acceptance to a college or university is an invitation to join the community. So part of putting together your application is having somebody who reads the application and then says, yeah, this is somebody who I want to have around for the next 4 years, because I think they're going to contribute to the overall academic, residential, intellectual, and extracurricular life of this institution. And I want to extend that invitation. Okay. So, they're looking for fit, and they're trying to make sure that a student understands the program and they're going to fit well within that program. So with international college counselors, one of the things that we do is spend a time trying to figure out the balance of academic interests, the courses that are going to have students be successful, where they want to take those academic interests, what majors line up with the things they want to do for a long-term personal professional plan, and then help them find the colleges and universities that match that. And when all of those things line up, right, their course load, their interests, their prospective major, their extracurricular life, all of those things kind of fit together, and they're in the right admission pools, then that's a representation of how things move more successfully, because they found that right fit. Okay, so if that's sort of philosophically writ large, if we're are there things that are more important, or things that get honed in on very, very quickly? And so that's really where we're going to go next. All right. So what specifically, when an admission officer sits down and reads an application, where do they go first? Right. I don't. It's not a big surprise that you knew I was going to go right to a student's transcript, their course load, the grades received in core courses, the institutional rigor, right? The grades received, the rigor that's taken on, and the success within that rigor is by far the most important factor within, an application, right? So, if your goal is to aspire into a highly selective institution, you need to take the most challenging classes that you can within your secondary school, and be successful within those classes. Okay. It doesn't matter whether you're in an international baccalaureate program, or your school does or does not apply, have AP courses. Each institution determines their own curriculum based on their community, and colleges and universities are very adept at figuring out what the curriculum is within that institution, and then they'll look to see whether or not the student is taking the most challenging classes offered. Within that curricular framework, you really have to push the 5 major core disciplines: English, math, science, social science / history, and obviously languages. So if you are, somehow deficient within one of those fields, I don't know, you decide to stop Spanish 2 after your sophomore year, they're going to notice, right? Because they expect, the honors level or AP level of a foreign language in their students who are applying and being successful within the applicant pool. So, and again, you can see on the screen, different schools use different weighting. So don't get focused on the GPA, because one school might give a full point for an honors or AP course, another might give half. So the colleges, universities don't really get wound up about the GPA. They're going to look at the grades, the rigor, and their performance within core courses. That is exactly where the analysis goes. And as I talk about this writ large, one of the things that always pops up and is always a pretty consistent question is, okay, well, the absolute classic admission officer question. Is it better to get a B in a regular track course? I'm sorry, an A in a regular track course versus a B in an honors or an AP course? And I completely understand where that question is coming from. When you hit the highly selective sphere, the Ivies and like institutions, they want the highly selective course and they want the A's. So as you elect a course load, the most important thing is to find that perfect balance between rigor and performance. The phrase that I always use is that you need to have, the toughest course load you can safely handle. And if you do that, then where your candidacy falls will find a balance point naturally. Right. So within the International College Counselors, really starting from ninth grade, there's so many of the courses are sequenced, but we do help students kind of figure out the plan for what are the appropriate rigorous courses. Where should you step forward, whether it's across the entire curriculum or whether it's in certain areas? What are your interests? Where are your strengths? And so I'll have conversations, with students, whether they're ninth graders or whether they're 11th graders and 12th graders, trying to figure out what's the best course load for them to create the strongest, presentation of their candidacy based on their academic areas of interest and the major and degree program that they want to pursue. So that's a conversation that happens all the time, and that is part of the programming that ICC offers. So if grades and performance within core courses is paramount, is probably the number one factor that exists out there. Standardized testing is probably number two. And it's really, it's really sort of swung back and forth in the post-COVID world. There were a time when 98% of the colleges were test optional, especially coming out of COVID. Now the pendulum is starting to swing back the other direction. And in fact, just as a counselor, I go back every spring and every summer and dig back into colleges and universities to see, has anybody changed their mind again? Has anybody gone back to requiring tests? Who's test optional? Who's test blind? Right now, Columbia and Princeton are the only schools that have said that we're going to stay test optional for a while as they figure out whether or not they can admit a class that they're excited about and they know is going to be successful based on their test optional policy. Colleges and universities, especially in the South, especially public schools, are coming back online with requiring tests. Some of the highly selected schools are staying test optional because they know it affects the size of their applicant pool and the diversity within that applicant pool. So it's gotten really murky. And having conversations about standardized testing with students is incredibly important, because you think in your core a really strong score that's representative with the overall applicant pool can help me. But in the test optional world, one of the little secrets about how the test optional world works is that when you're test optional, your average SATs go up, because anybody who's outside that middle 50th percentile isn't going to submit. So the next year, your average SAT gets higher. More people don't submit. So the next year, your average SAT gets higher again. So, one of the things that I'll do with my counselees is try to answer that question about, do you submit or not submit? And we'll literally sit down with their college list, look at the middle 50th percentiles and say, you should send it here, you should send it here, you should not send it here, not send it here. So the timeline for standardized testing, which particular standardized test, ACT versus SAT, whether or not to send. That's an ongoing conversation that I have with my college counselees to make sure that they're presenting their best self in terms of their candidacy. And it's something that the timing so in terms of when students take standardized testing, there are a lot of communities who feel that the more testing you do and the earlier testing you do, the better. I'm probably an anomaly in that, to be perfectly honest, because what I often say is you want to find that sweet spot, right? When you're ready, when you've done some test prep, when your curriculum matches what's on the SAT or the ACT, so that you feel confident, you've had some experience, you've done some practice tests. Right? Just going in without the background doesn't help you. Going in, as I said, with some confidence and some preparation, some intellectual maturity, that's going to really propel you as you move forward. And I have those conversations with my counselees all the time because it's important. So you've got your course load and transcript as appears on the transcript, and you've got your standardized testing. So those are the two sort of biggest pieces. And this is just a really interesting slide. And again, I'll leave this up for a little while, just so you can kind of digest it. But it gets at what I was saying in terms of the differences between the testing profiles. Right. So, oftentimes, so let's say you have a 35 ACT, you're a 99% test taker, right? And you're not in the top 25% at some of these institutions. So you submit your 35, absolutely, but it doesn't help because the vast majority of other students who submitted their standardized tests are going to be within that middle 50th percentile. So it will be acknowledged that it will be a strength, but it isn't an identifier or a signifier as it used to be. And so, one of the things that I've always joked about in the last, 4 or 5 years is that if a place like Boston College, remains test optional for the next 5 years, their average SAT and ACT is going to be the same as Harvard's because that score is going to go up and up and up and up and up and over time. And there's a ceiling that you can't get any higher. So the standardized testing is something that we have many conversations about because it's very complicated, but it is a significant component. And over time, it feels like it's going to be a significant component at some institutions. So now, as you start to go through and create a candidacy, and you're working on the application, you're doing the component parts. One of the things that we spend an inordinate amount of time, and it's actually one of my favorite things to do, is to work on students with their self-presentation and their essays. If you think about it, the essay is the only component of the application that you are, as a student, are doing right now when you apply. Everything else is being done by someone else or has happened in the past, right? Your recommendations are coming from somebody else. Your junior year grades are already in the barn. Okay. So the essay in your self-presentation is getting across who you are right now. So having an admission officer get a sense of your personality, what matters to you, the way your mind works, really get a sense of who you are is critical. Right. So we start working in the junior spring, really, on the common application essay. And I always encourage the students that I work with to come at it from a perspective of tell a story that only you can tell, right? Using an essay that anybody could have written is not going to help you, right? You have to have an admission officer get to the end of reading your essay and think to themselves, this is somebody that I want to get to know better based on the way you've kind of tickled their mind. Or if someone else walked into that admission officer's office and said, hey, who are you reading? It's like, oh, I was reading, J. Durso-Finley. It's like, well, tell me what he's about. He's like, hey, well, I just read the essay and this is what I learned about him. Right? Those are the things that have to come out in the essay. And having read literally thousands of essays that helped, thousands of kids, put their best self forward. I love doing essay work. And in fact, I was originally trained as a high school English teacher. And so it's a personal passion of mine that I really enjoy as part of my work at ICC. So now, in addition to the main Common App essay, 650 words, trying to communicate a sense of self, especially at the highly selective schools, the Ivy League schools, places like Chicago is famous for their supplemental questions. So the supplemental questions come as part of the main application. Some of them are related to the students' understanding of an institution. Some of them are related to the potential impact on a community. Some are related to their academic interests. But what's really been interesting over the years is that colleges and universities sometimes actually pay more attention to the supplements than they do the main common essay, because they know that the main common essay has been proofread and shown to an English teacher and shown to a college counselor and been revised and run through Grammarly, and for many high school students, it is the piece of writing that's gotten the most feedback or most eyes on it that they've ever written. The supplements, not so much. So college admission officers are savvy enough to look at the supplements to make sure they understand why they're applying, where they're applying, and what they're going to bring to an institution that's got a little bit more free form nature to it. Okay. And you can see some other hints that are on the screen right now. It takes a while. It's a process. I always tell the students that I work with that it's not like you can go home on the weekend and say, okay, I've got my Spanish translation. I've got 10 math problem sets and I'm going to write my college essay. That's not how it works. There's going to be multiple drafts. It's going to take weeks to get it done. And so what we do at ICC is a lot of brainstorming, a lot of revision. We share essays with each other. When the application is completed, we've got a double review process to make sure that my analysis of an application matches someone else's analysis of the application. And it has to be personal, academic, intellectual, and self-reflective, which is why AI doesn't work. Right, because that is objective, that's analytical, that's a distillation of information that's out there. And one of my favorite stories actually about students who are using AI about with their essays is that you talked to an admission officer at an Ivy League college last spring, which will remain nameless. But they talked about how they ran into this situation where they ran into a bunch of essays about why this college that kept on referencing a program that doesn't exist. And so they put the prompt into Chat GPT and it kicked out this program. So they knew that everybody who had applied, who put this program in their why this university essay had used Chat GPT. So there are ways in which that using the AI absolutely comes back to be problematic. So again, it needs to be personal, it needs to be introspective, it needs to be academic, it needs to be intellectual, it needs to be about you, and using AI just does not work. But again, we can help you kind of get through that to really present yourself in the best way possible. Okay. So we'll talk a little bit here about the extracurricular sphere and how that sort of comes into play. I think the mantra that we always talk about is like you want depth and not breadth. If you don't have 10 things that you put on the common application, it's not a problem. Any admission officer you talk to says they want you to do things over a period of time, whether it's service, whether it's academic clubs, whether it's theater arts programming. It could be anything, right? Whatever you're really excited about needs to have some depth to it. It needs to be contributed over time. So one of the things that sort of helps to round out a candidacy and our conversations that I have with students is how do we want to use your summers particularly well? How do we want to use the options that are available at your secondary school particularly well? And where can we find things to sort of round out your extracurricular and your co-curricular life that are outside of what's easily offered to you within the school? And that's a real interesting and important distinction, because just being involved in a few clubs in school, it doesn't carry a tremendous amount of weight. At the highly selective level, they want to see that you're doing things beyond what's easily offered to you. Okay, so we'll have conversations about whether it's service opportunities, whether it's academic opportunities, whether it's research, whether it's internships. The range is pretty strong and wide. But there needs to be some action and some activity. And that's a great conversation to have, because once students really dive into the things that are important to them, connect it to their academic and their personal and their professional life later on, it makes their high school experience and their college experience that much more rewarding. So we have conversations, as I said, in ICC all the time. We'll reach out and I'll say, hey, I'm working with a student who really wants to do classics or really wants to do computer science. What are the best opportunities for them to do an internship in this area or take a class in this area, and help students build up that resume. So again, the Ivy League and the highly selective institutions are looking for students who are reaching beyond what's easily available in their high school and beyond what just comes through their classroom experience. And so that's really what we're after, and we're going to help students kind of pursue that. Right. And then in terms of like helping to create the application itself, as most institutions, highly selective institutions, are going to request 2 letters of recommendation. So these are the people who are going to be your mentors, who are going to be your supporters. And so we'll help students, especially in the spring of the junior year, match up who are going to help with supporting a student's aspirations in their application based on their major and degree program, because that has to link up oftentimes. A student who's going to do engineering has a very different set of expectations for letters of recommendation than a student who's going to do creative writing. Okay. And so having those conversations about who might be a good recommender, and it goes beyond, to be perfectly honest, people who gave students good grades. Somebody who doesn't really know the person talks about what books were read and what papers were written and says, oh yeah, she was great, I gave her an A. That doesn't help in a highly selective environment. The person who really knows how a student's mind works and how they might have grappled with a particular subject area and triumphed is the kind of information that an admission officer uses in a committee to be able to really make an argument for inviting that person to campus. So again, this is something that I'll do with all my juniors every spring, have a conversation, have them give the information that's really necessary for students to be able to make that connection within their faculty. But that's part of the process. And it's something that is easily done and that we're happy to do. Okay, we're sort of coming to the end here. Excuse me. And so given this, the construction, the grades, the transcript, the rigor, the performance, the standardized testing, right, the essays and the writing and the personal sections, the extracurricular profile and how that's presented into an application, and then the letters of recommendation, all of those areas and the support and the guidance, that's something that I do, that we do, that I'm excited to be, part of a student's life, to put all of those things together. Okay. Now, again, in highly selective environments within the Ivy League, the analysis and the components of this are bigger than that. And I really I love this slide that was put together for this presentation, because again, if there's 58,000 U.S. high schools, that means there's 58,000 valedictorians. And when I looked at it, I realized that that's actually inaccurate, because there are many schools, especially in the Midwest and in the Northwest, that determine their valedictorians by an unweighted GPA. So when I was in college, I would read schools that had 40 valedictorians because they all had 4.0s, right? So if you think about the selectivity that exists out there, the numbers are just overwhelming. And I talked a little bit about how that came across in terms of building the class. So again, when I left college admission, over 20 years ago, we turned away more than 60% of the valedictorians that applied, which in some ways is a scary statistic, but in other ways it isn't, because it means that class rank isn't the only thing. Somebody who creates a really compelling profile, or has a compelling extracurricular, candidacy, or brings something else to the community, we weren't bound by rank. Okay. But it is important to understand the context and the competition, because if you're somebody who's the class president and is the number 2 in the class, that's awesome within your high school. In the context of the overall Ivy League admission process, you're up against many students who look like that, and it's just something to kind of keep in mind. Because what it really needs to do is not to dissuade you from your aspirations, and in fact, you should be aspiring to be in those pools and to try to gain access into these schools because of the amazing opportunities that they provide. But what it does suggest further is that you've got to find other ways to build your college list, and that's really what we try to do. right? So we think about admission plans, right? How do you work with, single choice early action? How do you work with early decision versus early action at, at Georgetown versus Dartmouth? When does it make sense to make a commitment? When does it not enhance your candidacy? So these are all conversations that we're having with students as to how to maximize their options, um, in terms of where their college list looks like. So yes, it is a highly selective world. But there's ways in which you can enter into the admission stream to again maximize that candidacy, and maximize those options. So given this, and again, from the overarching perspective, right? So, what else is out there? What should I be doing as a student? And if you're a parent, or a guardian, what should my child be doing at this stage? Right. And these are some general tips, to sort of, to start to think about, but it's one of the things that we do and that I do regularly with all of my students and all of my conversations, with students and families is, you have to build a really interesting, diverse, and deep college list. It can include highly selected schools. It can include schools within the Ivy League. It can include other places that offer specific merit options or scholarship programs that you might be after. It can include liberal arts colleges, which are highly academic, and students who might sometimes are coming out of big institutions, secondary school institutions, find it incredibly reinforcing. You need to be, very well organized. You need to do a tremendous amount of college research. You need to be connecting with your college counselor. You need to be connecting with your ICC counselor. You need to use your summers well. You need to, create a candidacy and a collection of backgrounds and interests and accomplishments that again produce that compelling academic profile. And it's something that, I had two conversations today, in fact, with students that I'm working with as to what we're going to do over the course of the year to bring together all of these disparate ways of having them, produce, the most interesting, and kind of resonant, student profile that they possibly can. So when it comes time for them to file their application, it's going to be looked at in a way that where an admission officer is going to slow down and go, this is really interesting. This is something, this is somebody that I want to find out more about. Okay. So that's the, once you're engaged with the guidance counselor or your ICC counselor, that's where we're going to go. And as I said, it can include highly selected schools. It may include Ivy League institutions, depending on where your strengths lie. But it's going to be a comprehensive approach. And that's just important to know, right? It is a multi-year process. You need to stay organized all the way from ninth grade on. You need to, help-seeking behavior is a critical skill for high school students. So whether it's me, whether it's an academic tutor, whether it's a guidance counselor or a college counselor within the secondary school, you need to be engaged and organized and motivated from the start, right? There's 3,500 post-secondary institutions in the United States, and obviously schools that are international that are incredibly academic, right? There's going to be a place that you're going to find your residential, your intellectual, your social, and your extracurricular fit. You're going to get it done. And if you have people on your side, whether it's your family or whether it's me or whether it's somebody in international college counselors, it's going to happen. So that's a really exciting aspect of moving through your high school life, because you're going to succeed. It's going to happen. And we're excited to help you through that. So I will leave this up on for a second here. Usually we're charged to get in under 50 minutes, and I'm about to crest 49, but I will leave this particular slide up right now. If you want to fill out an ICC info form, go ahead and hit that QR code. Take a screenshot. If you wanted to send me an email, I'm happy to respond. I know I have probably half a dozen questions in the chat, and I'm going to copy those, and I will respond to all of those directly to you. So I'll be sure to answer those questions. But I really appreciate your attention tonight. I hope that some of the information that I've provided has been useful. And if you want any more information, you have questions, you want to get some feedback, or you want to connect with members of the ICC community in terms of our scheduling team, you can fill out that info form there. You can email me directly, and I would be happy to help. So thanks so much for your attention, and hopefully we'll see you on another ICC webinar. So thanks so much. Have a great night, morning, afternoon, depending on where you are, but really appreciate your time, and wish you all the best of success in your college aspirations.